And I'm very happy to basically have the possibility to co-launch the report IRENA, IEA, and Renton have produced on a topic which is indeed really important. This is, as you mentioned, a follow-up report to the first report we have produced on renewable energy policies in times of transition. And I would really like to acknowledge the fact that all three organizations, the teams, but also more than 60 contributors have worked together on this topic. And I think this is something which is really important because it shows how important this topic is and needs to be addressed. Now, what we are doing in this report is indeed looking into investigating the status, but also the policies for renewable heating and cooling, because it is clear that this is a key to make the transition also happen in the sectors. There are transformation pathways towards efficient and renewable energy. And I think a big message of the report is technologies are there. We need to put in place the right policies. In the report, we are looking into different pathways, the electrification using renewable energy, renewable gases, sustainable biomass, direct use of solar thermal energy and geothermal, and also specific focus on district heating and cooling. And I think already the amplitude of these pathways shows the challenging situation we are facing in heating and cooling, or the complexity. What is also important with this report, we are really looking into the renewable-based, supply-based approaches. The reality is, especially in heating and cooling, we need to look in the different end-use sectors, and this is particularly buildings, industry, and to some extent agriculture. So as a next step, what is very clear that we will also need to use basically this knowledge which is there, the guidance and recommendations, to bring this into different ecosystems. Next slide, please. So Francesco has already mentioned this, but just here in concrete numbers. In the heating and cooling sector, it is very clear that fossil fuels still dominate the sector, with more than 70% of the energy demand in these sectors being provided by fossil fuels. Modern renewable energy only account for 10.4% of the demand. And this already shows that if we are really serious about the Paris Agreement and Sustainable Development Goals, it is fundamental that we accelerate the renewable uptake in these sectors. What is also very clear is we have in these sectors a large part, 11.9% of the demand is basically being covered by traditional use of biomass. And here we do not only have environmental implications, but also social and economic implications, which are really important to address, especially in developing emerging countries, with major health impacts and social impacts. The key sectors where basically heating and cooling occurs is, as I mentioned, in industry, in buildings, and in to some extent in agriculture, for heating and cooling there. And I think here it is very important to also see that there are economic opportunities linked to this. So next slide, please. It's very clear that we need an urgent transition in these sectors, and climate and sustainable development are not the only drivers for this. And I think this is really something which is extremely important to underline, especially when we have decision makers, policy makers that need to be convinced of the role of renewable energy outside of our energy bubble or ecosystem, I would say. It is about improving air pollution and related health impacts, obviously greenhouse gas, creating local jobs and local economic development. And I think this is something which is really key, because when we're talking about heating and cooling, we're very often talking about local markets too, and local market structures and local jobs as a result. Reducing energy poverty and also strengthening energy security. I take the example of the Netherlands, for instance. They have clearly engaged also in the development of efficient and renewable heat to ensure energy sovereignty and cover basically their demand here with local resources. Obviously, also the other part is universal access, because we still have 2.4 billion people relying on traditional biomass. Next slide, please. Why is the uptake in renewable heating and cooling not happening, or not happening quickly enough? The reality is that we do have barriers which exist at different levels, from the political institutional barriers down to end users' decisions. There is clearly a lack of political commitment. I'll come to this later. Policy frameworks are still built around fossil fuel-based energy systems. And the reality is, in an ecosystem which relies so heavily on fossil fuels, this is obviously a barrier, considering the fact also that subsidies for fossil fuels still persist. Now, transitioning out of it needs to happen, needs obviously also to happen by taking into account the social consequences. Solutions are here, or other challenges are economic and financial barriers, which is a key problem. The capital cost in renewable-based heating and cooling is higher than we would encounter it on fossil fuel, and we are not in a level playing field. Plus, it's also the structure of the ecosystems. There is not, differently than from renewable power, for instance, where we have a strong supply voice and industry. In heating and cooling, we have structures which are much more decentralized, not centralized in the same way. There are questions of workforces. The sectors are different, the needs are also different, and vary very much from one context to another. Next slide, please. The good news is, however, that there are already approaches which exist to make this happen. Now, approaches are very clearly, we need the right policy and regulatory frameworks. And I think this shows how urgently this is needed. There is still a policy deficit and also stagnation of policies, basically, when it comes to renewable heating and cooling. There's only 49 countries, excuse me, mostly in the European Union, that have targets for renewable heat. And this is compared to 166 countries on renewable power, for instance, as an example. You see that the line is stagnating here. And this is obviously something which is challenging. The good news is, since there is such a local context, subnational governments are stepping up. There are at least 110 cities that do have targets for 100% renewable heating and cooling. So clearly there is a need to bridge basically the national, subnational levels. Also, and I think that is something which is really important, when we're looking at the building sector, net zero building codes are a real possibility to drive basically efficiency and renewable energy. The reality, however, is that only 40%, if I'm not mistaken, sorry, I lost the, only 40% of the buildings are built with mandatory obligations, energy-related obligations and mandates. And this is obviously something which needs to change if we really want to move to efficiency and renewables. Now, again, we have a challenging situation here on the policy side, but the good news is, and Paolo will present these, when we're looking into the renewable pathways, technologies exist, and there are also really good examples of how to drive basically the uptake in renewable heating and cooling, also from the policy and regulator framework side. And I'm really hoping that many policymakers will turn to this report to make this happen. Paolo, I'm transferring to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rana, and I hope you can see me and hear me correctly. Now, let me give a little bit of more input on technology transformation pathways, the barriers they face, and what are examples of policy solutions. And let me start with electrification of heat. Now, electrification of heat with efficient devices can bring numerous benefits in terms of overall efficiency and environmental benefits. However, and this is in the figure in the left, apart from the exception of cooling, only limited shares between 14 and 18% of electricity are used for space heating, water heating, and cooking. Now, this is due to a number of barriers which are in dark on the right and which have some policy solutions more in the light. I will mention two in particular. One is the high upfront cost of appliances, notably for heat pump. This is typically addressed in many countries through capital grants, subsidies, loans, and rebates. This is a typical policy instrument. Another barrier, which is more complex but which can be very important, are high operational costs that are linked to the tariff structures. In some countries, there are high retail electricity prices, not necessarily because of the high electricity wholesale price, but because of taxes, levies, surcharges, sometimes even the feed-in tariff surcharges. Now, in order to address this issue, which become a very important barrier for heat pumps' competitiveness with other fossil fuels. In order to address this, some countries have introduced special electric heating tariffs for eligible high-efficient devices, and this is just the case of the UK renewable heat incentive system, for instance. In terms of other examples, I would definitely note the China Clean Winter Heating in Northern Regions pilot program, and also the application of times of use tariffs in other countries. Next, please. Now, complementary to electrification, there are, of course, renewable gases, as not everything can be done with electricity. They include biogas, biomethane, as well as renewable hydrogen. Now, around 50% of biogas, the central figure, is used for cogeneration today and commercial heat and buildings. And another 11% is upgraded to biomethane that can be directly injected into existing gas infrastructures. Now, if you look at the costs, in some cases, biogas can be competitive with fossil fuels, in particular if it comes from waste. However, more in general, policy instruments are needed to close the cost gap with fossil fuels. Now, this includes, for instance, renewable gas injection subsidies, as in the case of Denmark, which has another important policy instrument, which is targets. Denmark has a target of 100% renewable gas injected into the grid by 2035. France has 10% by 2030. Another important aspect that I would like to mention is evaluating in monetary terms the avoided methane emissions that would otherwise naturally occur. And this is a case, there is a very good example of a policy for that. That's the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard. And then in this case, the economics of biogas and biomethane change dramatically for the better. My last point is on renewable hydrogen. This is more expensive, but has also a much higher value. I will not spend too much on this. On renewable hydrogen, there are full of workshops, and there is an unprecedented momentum for that. But I would like to put the attention on one policy instrument, which is to look at policy supporting industrial clusters, because one of the first application of hydrogen is in industrial projects, like in the case of Rotterdam in the Netherlands. Next, please. Now, biomass. Biomass, and I repeat it, is always the overlooked giant of renewables. It's really dominating. 70% of total renewable heat today comes from biomass, and the modern biomass, I mean, sustainable, and 50% of total renewable final energy demand. Now, on this, I would focus on two aspects. One is dedicated measures to address cost and market barriers, and the examples are in Europe, like Italy, Conto Termico, France, Fonds Chaleur, and also dedicated loans and grants in huge developing economies like Brazil, giving loan support for biomass CHP, or India, very interesting grant scheme for industrial scale biomass cogeneration. The second aspect is, of course, sustainability. Biomass can and must be sustainable For that, you have to have clear, transparent sustainability criteria. One example is the one for heat in the European Union RED second directive, which require minimum levels of life cycle emission benefits and exclude support for a feedstock produced with high carbon stocks or biodiversity value. Next slide, please. Now, direct use of solar thermal heat today only represents 7% of total renewable heat, mostly used for domestic water heaters and large systems for agriculture. China, as you can see in the figure in the left, leads the world in deployment of solar thermal systems, hosting around 70% of world capacity. The deployment is promoted through a mix of targets, subsidies, and mandates. I would note here the combination of grants, fiscal incentives, and preferential loans also in Africa, in Tunisia and Rwanda, for instance, and in the Middle East, in Lebanon. Solar thermal can contribute also to district heating, maybe preheating, not completely at the level of the highest heat. This is an interesting example in Denmark, where, of course, the main driver is high fossil fuel taxes on the competing fuels. And my last slide, last but certainly not least, geothermal today is only 3% of total renewable heat, but with a great potential and growing very, very fast. Overall in the world, the main producing country is again China. Most applications are in buildings, but an important fraction also in agri-food industry, agriculture and forestry, and industry in few cases in New Zealand and Iceland, also in industry. Now, a specific barrier for geothermal is, of course, the de-risking geothermal exploration. And here I would like to focus on the really interesting case of the Netherlands, which has the fastest growing market in Europe, with a holistic plan for the applications of geothermal, including in horticulture, giving a general master plan, providing public data on geological resources, providing an insurance schemes when the things gone wrong. It is included in the general sustainable development subsidies, but it has also a feed-in premium for renewable heat, and with venture program collaboration between government and industry. So thank you for this attention, and I give the floor to Rabia. Rabia, thank you.
Thank you very much, Paolo. Thank you, Rana, as well. So in the 5 pathways that were just presented by Paolo, our analysis demonstrates also the great potential in providing solutions to the billions of people still lacking universal access to clean, affordable, reliable energy for heating and cooling services. I'm just going to name a few examples: efficient cook stoves and bioethanol, cooking fuels for billions of people that still rely on biomass for their cooking needs, which can obviously reduce indoor pollution and drudgery. And as you know, these have affected women and children in a disproportionate manner. Sorry, I'm not. So the second one is the small-scale domestic biogas digesters. They currently serve 125 million people and provide additional benefits through better sanitation and waste management. Another example is the electrified heating and cooling services, which can be provided through off-grid renewable energy technologies, especially given their falling costs. And last example is solar thermal and geothermal, which offers agro-processing services and help smallholder farmers conserve their produce and transform them into more valuable products, and therefore increase their income, but also their livelihoods. So now, what is important to understand is that these benefits can be realized by establishing a supporting ecosystem, which should include access to finance, de-risking tools, a conducive ownership model, efficient technologies that cater to specific needs, of course, also awareness raising on available solutions, but also the skills to distribute, install, and maintain those applications, access to new or existing markets to sell the products, and integrated resource planning as part of national level policies and targets. So as far now as cross-cutting policies to support the way forward to decarbonize heating and cooling services in all contexts, national and subnational targets are essential. More than 12 countries and the European Union have passed or proposed laws around net zero emissions. This includes China and the UK, and we're really happy to have with us today in our panel both countries represented, and we'll share more on the topic. Now, net zero targets are not immediately feasible for all economies, but the ambitions expressed in NDCs, for example, which are currently dominated by the power sector targets, should be raised for sectors with large heating and cooling needs. Then the national targets that are established need to be translated into long-term integrated energy plans that coordinate the deployment of renewables-based solutions with measures to raise energy efficiency and develop the needed infrastructure. This is important to avoid conflicts between the pathways that were presented here, and also to avoid that they lead to stranded assets. Just to give you one example, the operating lifetime of district heating and cooling network can reach 100 years. So before investing in such a network, it's important to assess the heating and cooling demand of the covered area, and by, for example, taking into account energy efficiency plans and establishing heat maps, etc. Now, to attract investments in infrastructure, policymakers should ensure the presence of sufficient demand to render the investment profitable, for example, by mandating connections in new urban developments. This requires coordination with other sectors, such as building and transport. So finally, ensuring solid institutional coordination that clearly defines roles and responsibilities and translates targets into actionable initiatives is really essential. This means that coordination between various governing bodies and stakeholders, including those responsible for and involved in energy, power, industry, agriculture and forestry, is needed. Now, the energy, as was mentioned by both Rana and Paolo, the energy transition also requires leveling the playing field with fossil fuels. Excluding the cost of externalities, hundreds of billions of dollars are currently spent on fossil fuel subsidies. Phasing them out and redirecting them toward the energy transition is key. Where possible, policymakers should consider adjusting and implementing fiscal policies such as carbon pricing to internalize the negative impacts of fossil fuels. However, important to note is that these policies require careful consideration of broader social and equity issues, particularly for low-income populations for whom energy constitutes a larger share of household expenditures and whose budgets do not leave many options. Generally, policy implementation should be based not only on their impact on the future energy system, but also on their socioeconomic impacts to ensure the benefits that we spoke about today are maximized and distributed equally. So solar water heaters, for example, can substantially reduce energy bills while creating local jobs and local industry. In 2019, for example, our annual jobs review shows that solar water heater industry accounted for about 800,000 jobs globally. Manufacturing and installing solar water heaters offers jobs, and the skills needed are readily available in most countries, being easily, or they can be also easily acquired by practitioners of other trades, such as plumbers or electricians. Now, again, the ecosystem that can maximize benefits is one that allows for broader systemic changes, including education and training, industrial policies, support for R&D and collaboration between industry and research institutions, Also important is the need to minimize the socioeconomic cost of transitioning away from fossil fuels. This requires a set of labor market and social protection policies. The transition of for workers in industries that are rendered obsolete needs to be smoothened by developing opportunities in new industries and providing reskilling options for affected workers. In conclusion, policies for renewables in heating and cooling should not be again considered in isolation. They should be viewed as a part of the broader socioeconomic structures upon which the energy system is built and with which it interacts. You see on the right-hand side of the slide how we connected it to basically energy, economy, society, and the earth. A systemic approach is therefore required in the energy sector, but also in the socioeconomic systems that we have built. So I thank you for your attention on behalf of Rana, Paolo, and I.